Greetings. My name is Tariq Cyril Amar, and welcome to the fifth episode of my podcast, The Ninth Wave. Today, I would like to talk about something that, for want of better words, I would like to call foundational lies or founding lies. Or maybe also a good expression would be lies of no return. And why that is the case, I'll explain in a few moments actually. But before I do that, and before I also explain why I think this phenomenon is a recognizable pattern in our reality, and that this phenomenon is extremely detrimental to us, before I get into that, let me very quickly also tell you why I'm actually thinking about this today, yesterday. What was the occasion, so to speak, for me to start considering this particular theme? The occasion is something very simple, really. The Wall Street Journal, which I think is above any suspicion of liking Russia, has come out with a much quoted article in which it states that the consensus of the American intelligence services, what the Americans love to call the intelligence community, which sounds always very sort of cuddly and kumbaya. But nevertheless, the Wall Street Journal has come out with this article, and it states that the consensus among these American intelligence services is that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is, after all, not to blame for the death of Alexei Navalny in February of this year in a Russian incarceration camp. You will remember that when Navalny died very suddenly, he was a comparatively young man. On 16th February of this year, in this camp very far away from Moscow, many politicians and commentators on traditional media and on social media jumped almost gleefully, after all, somebody had died, right? Gleefully to conclusions and told everyone that here was Putin had somehow indirectly, but by his orders, murdered what they called the leader of the Russian opposition. Now we have the Wall Street Journal, no less, reporting that the American intelligence services, no less, have come to the conclusion, which many of us who retained a cool head uh, have come to much, much earlier, that no, Putin did not do this. This has many aspects that I won't go into. For instance, it does not make sense, and I'm not trying to speak ill of a dead man here. My attitude to Navalny is on record, and it has always been extremely critical and very openly critical. But at the same time, I have always been explicit about the fact, and I'll say it again here, that I do not think he deserved to be behind bars and incarcerated. Now, let's set this aside. Whatever you think about Navalny, it makes no sense to describe him as the former leader of the Russian opposition. He had resonance in his time. He had a certain importance, but that favorite depiction of him in Western media and among Western observers who I think know nothing about Russia, frankly, simply was absurd, right? He was not that. He was something else. Anyhow, let's not go into the specifics of the Alexei Navalny case anymore. What I find interesting here is that we are seeing an open admission, for once, as it were, in major mainstream Western media that a favorite tale of the same media and of the mainstream in the West more broadly was simply wrong. And they are now admitting that. They're, of course, framing this in certain ways. We will not go into those. The main fact here is we have an admission by the American intelligence community, so called, and from them by the Wall Street Journal, that in reality, Putin was not behind the death of Navalny in February of this year. And that made me think, because I feel that there is a whole phenomenon, a pattern, as I said at the beginning, of what I call these narratives of lies of no return or foundational lies. And what they have in common is that, first of all, they're wrong, right? These narratives are wrong, usually, not usually, but always, by definition. They depict something in fundamentally false terms. And I will give you two more examples very soon, so you will see what exactly I mean specifically. They're wrong, but secondly, they attain enormous importance, or at least so it seems. We can argue there, but let's look at the surface first. They attain enormous importance in either um, selling, articulating, or perhaps, and perhaps I should say, shaping Western policy towards very important problems in international politics. And the third thing that these narratives of lies of no return or foundational lies have in common is that even when there is clear evidence accumulating that shows, that proves that these narratives are wrong, usually we don't abandon them, or at least our political and media elites do not abandon them. They simply proceed with the same policies that they proceeded with before, and that only makes sense if you actually still believe in these narratives. That sounds all very abstract. I know, I'm sorry, but I give you two examples now. One is the way that Western mainstream media and Western politicians, elites, have talked about, narrated, if you want an academic term, what happened on October the 7th in Israel, when the attack of the Palestinian resistance out of the Gaza Strip on parts of Israel took place. That is one example of that kind of narrative, of a narrative of lies of no return. The other example, and this is very close to what I am busy with professionally as a historian, the other example is what happened in Kiev, the capital, or it is about what happened in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, in February 2014. Right? And that is an event. That has entered, so to speak, contemporary history under the label the Maidan massacre or the Maidan snipers massacre. Now, I will talk about both of these events and how they have been spoken about in the West, propagandized really in the West, in a second. Let me say one thing right away. Of course, you could pick other examples. There have been other examples. There are other examples. These two are interesting to me personally, not only because I happen to be a bit of an expert on Ukraine and Russia, but also because they stand for, I think, what we can call the, at this moment, most catastrophically misguided policies of the Western elites. One is waging a proxy war against Russia through using Ukraine. And the other one is being complicit in the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians. Right? So these are not exactly the same things, obviously, right? One is about a proxy war, one has to do with a genocide, but they do have something in common, something very important. These are two Western policies, Western elite policies, that have caused immeasurable harm and that are going catastrophically wrong, right? And in both of these cases, we found these foundational lies or these lies of no return playing a large role. Now, what I would like to do next is discuss them one after the other in chronological order. So we'll talk a little bit about this event that is called the Maidan massacre first, and that took place in 2014. And then we will talk about October the 7th, to be precise, about how October the 7th has been presented in Western mainstream narratives and mostly misrepresented, really. And then in the end, I'd like to come to some conclusions. As always, I'm not claiming to offer you anything enormously original, but I do think that the phenomenon as such is something we need to talk about. I think it's of a certain urgency that we think about this problem of the foundational lies and what they're actually doing to our discourses, to our politics, and so on, and so on, and so on. So let's start with the so-called, with the Maidan massacre, right? So the Maidan massacre is a bloody event, there is no doubt about it, which happened towards the end of the struggle between whatever you want to call them, rebels, revolutionaries, I don't know, insurgents on one side, and the then Ukrainian government under a president that many of us will already have forgotten, called Viktor Yanukovych, who is now in exile, I think, in Moscow, in fact. Towards the end of this long drawn out struggle that really unfolds over the sort of winter months, 2013, 2014, there is a day, namely the 20th of February, on which a large number of demonstrators, but also police, also some police, are shot. Many of them die. Among the demonstrators, I think the death toll is at least 49 or 50. I know other figures have been circulating, but they're not very reliable. And many more are hurt. Among the demonstrators, we have to assume that there were at least 157, 160 people injured in this shooting incident. Now, nobody has ever doubted that this took place. Right? The whole thing as such is not fake news. It's a very real event. And many people, maybe there was a little bit of roughness at the edges about the figures, but many people, everybody again agrees, were killed and hurt on this day by sniper fire in the center of the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. The real issue has always been who did it. And when you go back to this time, you will find that no questions were ever asked initially. Almost no questions, I should say, but I will simplify this a little bit. The big picture in the West and in Ukraine, at least on the side of the insurgents, is immediately this was done by the police of the old president, of Viktor Yanukovych. Right? This story that Viktor Yanukovych used his police specific units, we don't need their names really, but Berkut played a role, Omega sniper team, Alpha sniper team, and so on. We don't really need this. This big story that Viktor Yanukovych used his police units to commit a massacre unfolded in enormous political power. The best expert, and we will quote him a little more in a second on this, is a Ukrainian-Canadian scholar, I should definitely mention him here, Ivan Kachanovsky. And Kachanovsky has rightly said this is a hinge moment. Maybe those are not his exact terms, but I think you would agree with the substance of the phrase. This is a hinge moment. This is a turning point, a milestone. It's not the only cause, of course, but it is a major turning point and milestone in the development that takes us from the crisis that erupts in Ukraine in very late 2013 to really where we are now, to a major war that takes place de facto between, on one side, Russia, and on the other side, Ukraine, sponsored, allied with, used by the West. Right? We are really looking already at an indirect war between also Russia and the West, which is catastrophic, which should never have happened. We all understand how incredibly dangerous it is. It is also very clear that we may not yet have seen the worst. It is possible that this will escalate further and lead to a direct clash between Russia and the West, which then is, technically speaking, really World War III. That's what that would be. And then the next big question would be, will it happen without nuclear weapons or with the use of nuclear weapons? I am pessimistic. I think if there is a direct clash between Russia and the West inside Ukraine, Russia would be forced actually to use at least small nuclear weapons precisely because Russia's conventional forces, although they have been extremely successful in this proxy war up until now, would probably have trouble beating back a direct massive intervention by the West, including, if it ever comes to that, American ground troops. And since that would be so difficult, Russian nuclear doctrine is actually very clear on this. The use of at least small nuclear weapons would become something that Moscow would consider. Anyhow, on the way from very late 2013 to where we are now, basically a decade later, in early spring 2024, this sniper's massacre was crucial. Not the only important point, but one of them, definitely. Top five, top three, right? Let's put it like that. And I should be precise here. It wasn't just that the massacre occurred and that all these poor people were hurt and even killed. It was something else. It was the precise way in which the West chose to interpret it. Namely, without asking any serious questions, immediately go to the conclusion that this was the old regime of Viktor Yanukovych, which is backed by the Russians, right? So all the bad guys are already in their corner where they belong. Let's push back. In reality, and this is what Ivan Kachanovsky has shown in years of simply breathtakingly precise, laborious, and also very lonely research. In reality, it is very, very clear that the majority of the demonstrators, of the insurgents, were killed and shot and hurt by other insurgents. Yes, I know, this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but in this case, the evidence is actually very clear by now that this is one conspiracy that actually has taken place and shaped our history massively and is still shaping it. This was actually a false flag operation, a real false flag operation with enormous success. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Those of you who find this still unbelievable, shocking, whatever, right? I know some people like that. Read up, consult Ivan Kachanovsky's key article on this, which has the title, let me read this out to you: The Sniper Massacre on the Maidan in Ukraine. It was published last year, can't remember the month, I'm sorry, sometime in the summer, I think, in a peer-reviewed journal. Absolutely nothing wrong with the venue there, called Cogent Social Sciences. It was, of course, published against resistance, as you can imagine. Some people were very interested in avoiding its publication. Now, I won't bore you with the whole article. Not that it's boring, it's a wonderful piece of research, but it is an extremely academic article. Kachanovsky is a very serious researcher and he takes no prisoners. So you will be assailed with large amounts of empirical data plus a theory, right? And obviously, this is not the place to try to reproduce this. Also, he has talked about this himself, and I shouldn't try to sort of, stand in for him. This is really his work. But I would like to read a few key passages to you, just to give you a sense of how important this research was, how solid it is, and what it actually means, to what conclusions he has come. And I think they're incontrovertible. So give me a second here. So, talking about his evidentiary basis, right? I'm quoting directly from the article now. This study combines content analysis of all publicly available videos, photos, and audio recordings of the Maidan massacre on 20th February in English, Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and other languages, with an analysis of several hundred testimonies concerning this massacre based on qualitative interview methodology. And believe me, Kachanovsky is a thorough guy. The manifest and latent content analysis, I warned you, gets a bit technical, covers over 2,000 videos and recordings, 2,000 videos and recordings of live internet and TV broadcasts of the massacre in nearly 50 countries. News reports, social media posts by 120 journalists covering the massacre from Kiev, more than 6,000 photos, and close to 30 gigabytes of publicly available radio intercepts of snipers and commanders of the security service of Ukraine and internal troops. The study analyzed interviews and statements by several hundred witnesses in media and social media. Most of these testimonies are by eyewitnesses, mostly Maidan protesters. This is the insurgents, right? And Western and Ukrainian journalists. Testimonies of indirect witnesses concerning Maidan snipers are primarily Maidan protesters, politicians, and pro-Maidan journalists. Such statements against interest relayed by indirect witnesses are accepted in criminal law and trials in so on and so on and so on, right? Here is the conclusion he comes to, and I've left out most of what he tells you about his methodology. It's a long part of the article, and if you want to read it all, you will see that he goes into much more detail concerning like several databases he sets up and so on and so on. But here is his conclusion. It comes in two parts. Content analysis of synchronized videos, audio recordings, and photos, and analysis of various publicly available evidence showed that killed and wounded policemen, and at least the absolute majority of 49 killed and 157 wounded Maidan protesters were massacred by snipers in Maidan-controlled buildings and areas. Right? The people who shot them, and you could also see this from forensic analysis, including ballistics, of course, model building, and so on. But the people who actually shot these victims were in buildings and places that were under control of the insurgents. The troops, the police of the former president were not in the places from which the victims were shot. In many cases, in the cases of the absolute majority of victims. The analysis found, this is Kachanovsky again, that the Maidan massacre of the protesters and the police on 20th February 2014 was a successful false flag operation that was rationally organized and conducted by elements of the Maidan leadership. These are the insurgents. And concealed groups of Maidan snipers working for parts of the insurgents in Maidan-controlled buildings in order to win the asymmetric conflict during what was then called the Euromaidan and seize power in Ukraine. And they succeeded doing that. And they also succeeded, obviously the West also wanted this to happen, in building an incredibly close, if uneven, client-vassal relationship with the West. In the end, the tragedy, of course, of all this is that it has turned out horribly for Ukraine, leading them into this proxy war that has cost hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, and the agenda of which is a geopolitical agenda coming out of Washington. Right? And in the end, Ukraine and the West are also extremely likely to lose it. I personally think they are losing it as we speak. So none of this has worked out well, even on the terms of the people who did it. But back to our initial point, what I'm trying to tell you here is that this is one of the most important lies of no return in our time, certainly in my lifetime. It has had enormous effects. It could actually still get us to World War III. Or, let me be precise, let me not exaggerate, it could play a big role, one important role in getting us to World War III. This is how successful, effective this particular lie of no return has been. Now let me talk about the other one. How the West and Israel, of course, have shaped the narrative around the October the 7th attack by the Palestinian resistance led by Hamas. It wasn't only and exclusively Hamas, but mostly Hamas, on parts of Israel, right? You all know the standard narrative there. The standard narrative, and I have talked about this before, I know, is that Hamas, the Palestinian resistance, broke out of Gaza, or the Gaza Strip to be precise, simply to commit a heinous rampage of terrorist acts, including countless atrocities, right? This story we know very well by now. In this respect, it's very similar to what happened by now in the case of the Maidan massacre, has been in large parts disproven. It has been disproven. The evidence already exists. We owe this to partly, but no, we owe this mostly, I should say, I think, to a small number of excellent investigative journalists, some of them at the Gray Zone, for instance, right? Some of them not to be forgotten here at the Electronic Intifada. I think personally, this to me seemed to be the most important drivers of bringing to light the truth against the Israeli propaganda narrative. Others then have played a role as well, for instance, The Intercept, or indeed some Israeli media, like Haaretz, right? There are Israeli media that have admitted, recognized that parts of this very simplistic narrative that Hamas simply stormed out of Gaza and then committed a huge terrorist massacre are simply wrong, right? And I would go further, I would say they're lies. They are deliberately created and spread propaganda lies to facilitate the genocide that has now been unfolding for basically half a year. Now, we can go, and we should go as well here, as with the Maidan massacre, into a few details, right? One important story was the story of systematic mass rape. This story has been completely debunked by now, and has been completely debunked. In fact, the debunking has turned into one of the, I think, most severe scandals in the history of the New York Times, which took the lead in spreading the story in the West. Then there were atrocity stories, such as that 40 babies were decapitated, that babies were baked alive in ovens, and similar tales. All of them have by now been proven to have absolutely no basis in fact. And in several cases, it has been reconstructed how and by whom precisely these lies were deliberately created. Right? This is all there. You can read on the details on these matters if you look at the work of people at the Gray Zone, including but not restricted to Max Blumenthal, if you look at work on Electronic Intifada, Ali Abu Nima, and the people who work with him, Marsavin Stanley, Nora Friedman Barrows, and so on and so on. So this is no longer a matter of debate. This is not a matter of opinion. We know that a lot of the initial atrocity stories were false. Moreover, we know that they were deliberate fakery. They were meant to be false and they were meant to be spread widely so that Israel would gain, as it were, a free hand to commit a genocide in Gaza. Now, there are a few details that we could still add, and I would like to do this to give this a bit more of substance, as it were. We know, and we've known this for a long time, those of us who wanted to, that the main purpose of this attack out of Gaza, out of the Gaza Strip by the Palestinian resistance was actually military. It was to attack the basis of the so-called Gaza Division, which is the part of the Israeli army that guards what is in essence the concentration camp of Gaza, which is, as we know now, in the process of being turned into an extermination camp if the Israelis get their way, which I don't think they will in the end, not entirely. So this was a purely military attack. This part of the attack was purely military. I've explained this many times. There's absolutely no doubt that it was legitimate because the Palestinians under international law have the right to armed resistance against Israeli forces. So everything in the, let's say, Hamas attack as a short form of 7th October that was targeting soldiers, tanks, military bases, was definitely not a crime, and it was perfectly legitimate. Now, we also know that, for instance, civilians died at a music festival, the Nova Music Festival, right? What seems to have happened there mostly is that there was a shootout between the attackers, the Palestinian resistance, and guards at the festival, and that civilians got caught in the crossfire. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that these civilians are not to be mourned. We shouldn't be cynical. I would very much resist this. But under international law and the law of armed conflict, it means that even those civilians do not necessarily constitute crimes. Or I should say, to be precise, those civilian deaths do not necessarily constitute crimes. This is a gray zone in the law. That's the way it is. If you find that shocking or harsh, yes, that is actually the nature of humanitarian law, because it's a law about war, right? We also know, and this is, I think, more important, that Israeli forces killed a lot of Israelis. We don't know exactly how many. We may never know because it was so chaotic, but the evidence is really overwhelming that, for instance, at a place called Kibbutz Be'eri, which is where a lot of Israeli civilians died, many of them were killed by indiscriminate Israeli fire. And this has been admitted in Israeli media, that a decision was made that rather than to hold back in the firefight against the Palestinian resistance fighters, right? Rather than that, to use tanks and just shell the buildings in which these resistance fighters were barricading themselves, but simply accept that then the Israelis who were with them, who were their prisoners at this point, their captives, would die with them as well. This is very clear. We have very clear evidence that this has happened in at least this one location, I would guess in others as well. We also know that two squadrons of Apache helicopters were in the air for a long time on that day and systematically shooting everything that was moving, especially cars, towards Gaza on the ground. There is really every reason to assume that they killed a lot of Israelis who were taken in these cars as captives by Palestinian resistance fighters. Now, taking hostages is a war crime. At least this type of hostage taking certainly is. It is actually. I'm not trying to justify the taking of hostages, but the fact remains that the Israelis then killed these hostages. It wasn't actually, in these cases, the Palestinian resistance fighters, it was the Israelis, most likely following what is known as the Hannibal Directive or the Hannibal Doctrine. I've talked about this before as well, so I don't want to go into it again. The Hannibal Doctrine is, in essence, very simple. It says before we, the Israeli forces, allow Israeli military personnel to be taken captive and become a bargaining chip in the hands of the Palestinian resistance, we rather use so much force that we kill these captives together with the Palestinian resistance fighters. Right? This is the essence of the Hannibal Doctrine, and there's every reason to assume that on 7th October it was used against civilians by Israel, that Israeli officers, the Israeli leadership, Israeli Apache helicopter pilots, Israeli tank commanders made decisions, either one centralized decisions or one after the other on the ground, basically saying, before we let the Palestinian resistance fighters escape, before we let them especially escape with Israeli captives, we rather kill everyone. Right? The evidence that this happened is overwhelming. And once again, I don't want to refer it here because it's been worked on by others. This is not what I've done. This is what others have done, thankfully. Once again, I'd like to underline the gray zone and the electronic intifada in this respect. And it's easy to find. You can read what they've written and you can watch their shows and you will find the details explained of what I've just mentioned. Now, having gone into these two stories, right, that have really shaped or helped shape or at least been a major part of the articulation, the propaganda arm of Western policies, right? These foundational lies, these lies of no return. I would like to do what I announced at the beginning as my last part of this episode, which is try to draw a few general conclusions. Why is it this pattern, the creation, and then the obstinate adhering to of these foundational lies, of these lies of no return, is so detrimental, right? Now, obviously, you could very well argue that, when you believe something, make yourself believe something that is fundamentally at variance with reality, that fundamentally doesn't match reality, it's always wrong, right? In many ways, it can be, morally speaking, a lie. It can be a delusion, right? It is certainly not a good thing to happen or to make happen to yourself, right? This is clear. This is clear. But I do think that there are good reasons to be a bit more specific, right? Apart from this very general point, which is absolutely true, why is it a bad thing? What does this actually do to us and to the world that we have these foundational lies, these lies of no return? And I came up with really 4 or 5 simple points here, and I would like to just talk about them. One is, when you stick to such a false narrative, you can never ask about the truth, right? When you have a false answer and you stick to the false answer against the accumulating evidence, then you deprive yourself of the opportunity to ask a simple question. If my false narrative was that, if it was false, what was the truth? And one aspect of this would be that you would have to ask, in narratives which are very much about blame, right? If those guys were not the baddies in the Ukrainian case, if it wasn't, at least mostly, and probably preponderantly, if it was not the police, right, of the old regime, of the regime of President Viktor Yanukovych that committed this massacre in February 2014, then who was it? Because nobody doubts, as I said at the beginning, that it took place. Nobody doubts that. So if you let go of the false story, you finally free up your mind to ask a very important question, namely, well, if it wasn't these guys belonging to Yanukovych, who did it? Right? And of course, you know that Kachanovsky has answered this question. He answered the question and he showed us that it was a provocation, that it was a false flag operation, and that it came not from all insurgents, obviously. A lot of insurgents, a lot of protesters became the victims of this provocation. They were shot. But that it came from a part of the insurgents who thereby wanted to shape politics by shaping how Ukrainians see the world and especially how we in the West see the world. And they've succeeded, unfortunately, very, very much. Now, if we finally let go of the false story, we would finally be able to understand that we are allied, actually, in a proxy war with the regime that came out of that. Not directly. I understand this. I understand this. But we are still allied with the post-Maidan regime. We are allied with a regime based on a massive, big, fat lie. And this should certainly make a difference, right? Shouldn't it? Similarly, in the case of the October the 7th attack in 2023, last year in Israel, obviously, if we finally face the fact, all of us, that of the more or less 1,200 Israelis who died on that day, which is a tragedy, several hundred at least were likely to have been killed by Israel, we would have to let go, at least mentally, if we were consistent, of our facile, stupid agreement with everything that Israel does. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. I understand, of course, that the people who support Israel to the hilt, whatever it does, including with genocide, probably will never change their mind. They don't want to change their mind. There are very different reasons why they don't want to do this. Nevertheless, I do think it would make a difference if, at least in our public sphere, in the mainstream media, for instance, we would finally let go of the false narrative of the lie of no return so that we can make room for a more realistic explanation of what actually happened on that day that would show us that from the get go, the Israeli side was involved in a very sinister way, even on that day, and even in violence against its own citizens. Right? That might help to some extent. Now, another point is that by sticking to these lies of no return, as we do obstinately, we are creating constituencies. And what I mean by this, we are creating whole groups in our societies in the West that have a vested interest or a psychological stake in the lies, or both. This can be about career, right? If you work at the New York Times, you probably better keep believing this nonsense. Otherwise, your career there is over. It can be psychological. People may be so impressed by the initial story, especially because these stories are in a often gruesome way sensationalist, that it becomes almost part of who they are. And it becomes very difficult for them to let go of these stories. This explains, I think, some of the aggression one encounters, including on social media, but not only, when one challenges these stories. They're wrong, we have the evidence they are wrong, but they somehow have connected to feelings of self worth, it seems, in quite a lot of people. And letting go of them becomes very different. It becomes difficult. It becomes a matter of ego. So, by sticking to these stories, let me repeat this, we are creating whole groups in society that are somehow attached, career wise, psychologically, by social conformism, to these specific lies of no return. And there I would go a step further, I would generalize and say that we are creating their propensity to attach yourself to lies. If you once train your mind, right? Good old Orwell, right? If you once train your mind to believe a big fat lie and pretend that you cannot possibly see the evidence that has already debunked it, you are ready for more. And that is an enormous problem on a large scale. Now, there is a third point, which is those who are obviously delusional or lying lose credibility, right? This is very obvious. And this is true for the elites of the West, the mainstream media, the mainstream politicians, or actually basically all of our political elites, almost without exception, which thereby lose credibility, respect, legitimacy. Right? It is the same elites that then will turn around and say, oh my God, how is everything getting so populist and radical? Nobody believes us anymore. Well, yeah, nobody believes you anymore. And there are very good reasons, because you're sticking to lies that are obvious, that have been debunked. This, at the latest, would be the point where you would have to change course. You're not, you're losing credibility. But also, it holds outside the West, right? The elites of the West also, of course, lose credibility in the rest, the West, right? That is most of the world. That part of the world that is not the West, not the global North, looks at us and is like, well, these people are either bonkers or they're incredibly mendacious. So why should they pay a lot of attention to what our elites say? No, they won't, right? And there you have a geopolitical aspect, if that's what you want. And then, of course, there is something which I would call the problem of partial correction or false correction. Think of the claims about beheaded babies and babies baked in ovens that were made by Israeli propaganda after October the 7th. These claims were repeated by people as powerful as Biden, Joe Genocide Biden himself, and his foreign minister, Secretary of State Butcher Blinken, right? They were repeated by these people. They were spread by American media. But interestingly enough, these claims were also sometimes retracted because it became so obvious that they are wrong, right? So they were retracted occasionally. But here's something very interesting happens. You see that a detail of the big fat lie, the lie of no return, the foundational lie, is retracted, but it makes no difference. This is what I call partial false correction. It makes no difference. The impetus of the story, what a story implies for political action remains completely intact, which is, of course, perverse, right? You actually retract the factual content. You admit this actually did not happen, but then you go on as before. This is, if this happened in an individual, you would think that individual is suffering from psychosis, delusion, schizophrenia, something like that, right? If it happens in politics and society, it's extremely disorienting. And once again, it also tells attentive observers that in a way, factuality makes no difference anymore to these elites. Even when they are forced, kicking and screaming, to give up on a fragment of their lives, they still pretend that the overall story is somehow true and they still follow the policies that they associate with that overall story. Right? And then there's another form of false correction, which is too late. Of course, sometimes these foundational lies are, recognized by larger parts of populations as being just that, false stories, fake stories. But when this happens, years or decades usually after these issues have stopped being urgent, right? It doesn't help at all. In fact, it creates a false sense of security. This is what creates a sense in societies in the West that, yeah, well, we may get it wrong sometimes, but in the end, we actually acknowledge the truth. Yeah, well, the end is so late that it's always far too late. How convenient. The truth is acknowledged, right? Tonkin incident wasn't really what the Americans were telling us at the outset of the engagement or at the escalation of the engagement in Vietnam, but that was acknowledged well after the war was over, right? And many people haven't even heard about it by now, right? So this too late, this learning too late, this letting go of a foundational lie, of a lie of no return, too late, is not actually a sign of hope and it's not helpful. It creates a sense of false security. The challenge is precisely to revise such a story, such a fake story, such a false story, while it still matters. And the last point I would like to end on actually for today is very obvious. And that's why I've kept it for last, maybe, which is as long as we in the West, our elites, our mainstream media, cling to these lies of no return, it is almost impossible to negotiate and compromise. Because what these stories usually have in common is that they depict the other, the geopolitical opponent, right, as not just an opponent. No, no, that's not bad enough, but as totally evil and or totally irrational, right? This is why the constant comparison with Hitler is so important in our culture, right? Putin is not Hitler. That's complete nonsense. Tim Snyder can repeat it as often as he likes, or whatever he's exactly repeating at this point. The point is that if you depict the other, be it the Palestinian resistance, be it Russia, as completely crazy or completely demonic, evil, then of course you're creating a story that says looking for negotiation, looking for compromise, looking for a quid pro quo, looking for a way in which we can end the conflict peacefully is useless because these people are beyond the pale of negotiation. Right? This is what these foundational lies also do. And that is, of course, why they have this enormous political value for those large parts of our elites who want escalation. And this is why it's so important that, as far as we can, we push back against this, obviously. Not that I think that I personally, with this particular episode, can make a big this difference in this regard. Obviously not. I haven't gone bonkers yet. But if it helps a tiny little bit, if maybe the concept of the foundational lie or the lie of no return is of some use for debates, discussion, analysis, then once again, I'm happy, I'm content for today. Thank you very much for your attention.